honorable whips and acting whips. Make a list of those who are going to speak and get the list to me. I don't want a repetition of yesterday. I'm fishing around for speakers. Do your job. I'll do mine. I give the floor to the Honorable Biman Prasad. You have the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I speak on the report, Mr. Speaker, I just saw a front page picture of you and mine in the government propaganda newspaper. It's fake news, Mr. Speaker. It's fake news and some fake analysis.
Honorable Member, how come I'm looking old and you're still looking young?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this report has come after the die was cast, so to speak, Mr. Speaker. As the report points out, 2 general elections have already been held. And there has been very little, well, you worry about Panadol, Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's better than, and there's been little or no heed paid to the recommendations of the 2014 annual report of the Electoral Commission, and indeed the Multinational Observer Group findings into the 2014 general election. But Mr. Speaker, it's better late than never. As the committee states, it is important that a special parliamentary committee established to review the entire electoral process. And time is of the essence, Mr. Speaker. We are less than 17 months away from when elections can be held at the earliest in 2022, which is July next year. This has been confirmed by the Electoral Commission during its recent meeting with the political parties. Might I add, we have even lesser time if the issuance of writs and nomination period is taken into account, Mr. Speaker. But instead, Mr. Speaker, what we see is this government actually forging ahead and blatantly ignoring what was recommended after the 2014 and 2018 elections. It only made cosmetic and not real changes as recommended by the Commission and MOG after the nation went to the polls in 2018. And government seemingly has no intention, Mr. Speaker, of adopting major recommendations from the reports in 2014 and again in 2018. Basically, the government is turning a blind eye to substantive changes. It has decided to make some changes that it thinks are suitable, as seen in the bills of the Electoral Amendment Act and the Political Parties Amendment Act tabled in December 2020. Mr. Speaker, I do, however, wish to thank the committee under the chairmanship of the Honourable Alvik Maharaj, who is not here, for the bold recommendations. In fact, I think the committee has done a real good job in scrutinizing the report and making some very useful recommendations. And in fact, the Honourable Maharaj and his committee, Mr. Speaker, if I may just add, have done justice to the role and functions of a parliamentary standing committee, in my view, fearlessly performing the role of scrutinizing the merits and demerits of the report, which was referred to the committee by you yourself, Honourable Speaker. And I think this is the first time that I also see that there are no regard to political consequences. The committee did not stray from the truth and have made recommendations that, if adopted, will uphold unblemished electoral credibility and integrity. So I really want to thank the committee for doing the job. An example of this is the committee's agreement with the Electoral Commission, recommendation that it must have its own budget and be free to seek independent legal advice. If you look at the Commission's report, it notes that its request to the Minister for Elections on this issue was basically ignored, and we wonder why, Mr. Speaker. Absolute independence of independent institutions is totally necessary for transparency. The executive summary on page 4 of the Commission's report, which is also noted by the committee, states, and I quote, "The EC's work was affected by it not having a services of an independent legal advisor. Repeated requests for an independent legal consultant to the Minister of Elections remain unanswered." Mr. Speaker, it does raise serious questions as to why the Commission's requests were repeatedly ignored, especially when the Minister for Elections happens to be the Honourable Attorney General, as well as he is also the General Secretary of the Fiji First Party, he is the registered officer of the Fiji First Party. But that was 2014. You fast forward that to 2021, and yes, the status quo remains the same. I mean, the Fiji First General Secretary is still the Attorney General, still the registered officer, and still the Minister for Elections. The Honourable Minister, I've heard him say once that, in the previous administration, the Prime Minister was responsible for the elections. But Mr. Speaker, they did not deal with the elections office in their political capacities. And besides, we didn't have this Political Parties Act or Electoral Act. They didn't have to operate under that. And obviously, they didn't have a say in the appointment of the supervisor of elections. So, the Electoral Commission, Mr. Speaker, is very, very important. The Electoral Commission's recommendation for the position of supervisor of elections to be re-advertised, again, was ignored. I mean, if there was a requirement there, Mr. Speaker, in the advertisement in the first place, then that should have been followed. So, Mr. Speaker, that is all history. But what I would say to the government is history should not repeat itself. And that is why the Standing Committee, in my view, has rightfully recommended a thorough parliamentary review of the electoral process. And I think it is absolutely important, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the recommendations in 2014 election, the Multinational Observer Group, and indeed the 2018 Election Observer Group, there are a number of issues that were highlighted by the Multinational Observer Group, even though the terms of reference was very, very narrow. I mean, ideally, we should be inviting the Commonwealth Election Observer Group, the European Union Observer Group. These are credible, observer groups that observe elections around the world. And I remember, Mr. Speaker, the Commonwealth Secretariat had actually written to the government offering a Commonwealth Observer Group to observe the elections in 2018. So this Parliament, Mr. Speaker, did not deal with reports of 2014 election. I mean, we had 4 years. We're looking at this report after 6 years, Mr. Speaker, when we should have, as a Parliament, as leaders, we should have looked at the 2014 Election Commission's report, the Multinational Observer Group, and done the right thing, because any talk of genuine democracy, Mr. Speaker, anywhere in any country, rests on the integrity of the electoral process. If there is any perception that the election processes, election conduct has any doubts, it does not lead to a genuine democracy. Many countries around the world, Mr. Speaker, have elections. They have elections. Elections is just one part of achieving, genuine democracy. It's a very important part. And we need to ensure that we accept the recommendations of this committee. In fact, the committee is saying Now the committee points out 2 elections were held, it's time to review. And I think they are right. The honorable members in that committee are absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. They ought to be commended for coming up with that, with this recommendation. And surely, Mr. Speaker, if we in this parliament, believe in transparency, accountability and good governance, but more importantly, absolute independence of institutions, because Parliament, Mr. Speaker, is the supreme oversight body. Every institution in this country, including the executive, some newspaper so-called analysts, they don't understand this issue of separation of powers. Parliament is the supreme oversight institution. Every institution is accountable to Parliament, including the executive. Including the executive. Executive is accountable to this Parliament. They are accountable to this Parliament.
Order.
Very important, Mr. Speaker, for us to understand that. And this is why the 2 bills before the committee, Mr. Speaker, are premature. We need to go by the recommendations of this committee. Let's set up a parliamentary committee and deal with the recommendations of, and I'm sure the 2018 election report is being considered by the committee right now. Let's wait for that report. And let's set up a parliamentary committee. Let's, as I said, Mr. Speaker, politics is not just about winning elections. Politics is about doing the right things by the country, by the people. So let's do that. Let's accept for once this parliamentary committee's recommendation, and let's set up a parliamentary committee. We still have time. We have 17 months. Let's do that and come as a parliament and deal with those recommendations, so that when we go into the elections in 2022, we're all happy and sure that the processes surrounding elections, the conduct of the elections, the role of the Electoral Commission is all, properly accounted for. If we don't do that, Mr. Speaker, the perception of bias, the perception of rigging, perception of vote buying, perception of not having a free and fair and a credible election will remain, and we will remain a democracy struggling, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
I thank the